In this lesson, we explore Vray Virtual Frame Buffer. Basically, Vray Virtual Frame Buffer, or VFB, is a display window for Vray renders that include a number of Vray specific features which is not available in the 3ds Max frame buffer or 3ds Max rendered frame. And we'll learn all about these capabilities in this lesson. For now, let's open up the render setup window, and under Vray tab we have a frame buffer rollout, and here you can control some aspects of the frame buffer and also control how and where to save your final render. Using show last VFB button, you can open up the VFB window and take a look at your last render. And this is exactly the same as the last VFB button in the Vray toolbar. Enable built-in frame buffer is what allows us to render into the Vray virtual frame buffer. And if I disable it and render the scene, the rendering will be done in the 3ds Max's frame buffer and not Vray's frame buffer. Let me enable it again. Memory frame buffer, when enabled, creates the Vray frame buffer and lets you see the rendering process and generated image. And this process requires some memory. But if you are rendering a high resolution image and you have tons of render elements and the scene is very complex and heavy and consumes a lot of RAM, to save some memory you can disable memory frame buffer and enable Vray raw image file and then define where you want to save your render. And this way you don't get a feedback while rendering in the frame buffer. However, the image will be saved when the render is finished. And this way you get your final image and actually save some RAM, but without any live feedback in the virtual frame buffer. So if I disable memory frame buffer and start a render, you can see the engine is rendering the scene, but there is no live feedback of the process in the frame buffer. But if Vray raw image file was enabled and we had defined where to save the file, the render would have been saved in that path. So memory frame buffer option is here in case you are working with a heavy scene or a big final render and need to save some RAM. Let's make sure it's enabled for now. We have get resolution from max and it is enabled by default, and that's why Vray frame buffer takes the render resolution from the common tab of the render setup window. And if I want to set the render resolution from this rollout, I can simply disable get resolution from max and define the desired render resolution and pixel aspect ratio. I want to talk to you quickly about the most optimized way of rendering your final image in Vray and whether to specify the resolution here or in the common tab. Obviously, when we are rendering with 3ds Max, the render will happen in the 3ds Max's frame buffer, and when using Vray, virtual frame buffer will be used. But due to some technical issues, even when rendering into Vray's frame buffer, Vray still needs to create 3ds Max's frame buffer, even though the engine wouldn't send any data to 3ds Max frame buffer and all the information will be sent to Vray frame buffer. But that initial effort will cost some memory, so this is how Chaos Group suggests we approach rendering. In the common tab, set the output dimension to a very low value. In this case, we have an image aspect ratio of 1, so let's set the width and height to 100 and 100. In the render output group, disable rendered frame window, which is 3ds Max frame buffer. Now under Vray tab and virtual frame buffer rollout, make sure get resolution from max is disabled. Now you can define the resolution, which was 800 by 800. And now if you start the render, you are gonna have some optimized experience and rendering. Let me stop the render for now. In the render elements tab, you can see we have some render elements defined here. We're gonna be using them in a moment. Let's get back to the Vray tab. Next we have Vray raw image file, and when enabled you can directly save out your render to disk without storing any data in the RAM if you are using bucket image sampler, obviously. For now, let's enable it and let's save the file in the render output folder for this lesson. In the final render folder, and let's name it Blue Room or whatever. In this case, let's choose OpenEXR as the format. Now if you want to save the render in the 32-bit space or as DeepEXR, you can enable them here, otherwise the render will be saved as a 16-bit image. For now that's okay. I'm gonna press save here. This will save out all the render elements in one EXR file that you can later on extract it in Nuke or After Effects or any other application that you have. Now, if we disable memory frame buffer, obviously we won't see the live feedback of our render in the frame buffer, which is very cool if we want to save some memory. So let's disable it for now. But we can utilize this generate preview option, which creates a small preview of what is being rendered. So let's render the scene and see what we get. As you can see, we get a small preview of the render, and we only have this RGB preview path to look at while the scene is being rendered. Now that the render has finished, if I open up the folder that we saved the render to, we have an EXR file containing the beauty path and all the render elements that can be extracted later on, and we discussed this in the render elements lesson. For now, let's disable Vray raw image file and enable memory frame buffer. If you want to save out all the render elements into separate files or images, you can enable separate render channels option. For this to work, you need to have memory frame buffer enabled. Now you can use the browse button and define where you want to save the files. Let's go to the final render folder of this lesson, which is in the render output folder of the project file folder. And name it Blue Room separate or whatever you want. This time let's use JPEG as the output format and press save. And in the JPEG image control window, just press OK. Also in the rollout you have this save RGB and save alpha options, which if you disable them, the RGB and alpha channels won't be saved and only the render elements will be saved out. Now if we render the scene, all the render elements and our beauty and alpha passes also will be saved out in separate files to that final render folder that we define. Let's render the scene and see what happens. We get our full live feedback in the frame buffer. We have all the render elements to look at. For now, let's wait for the render to be finished. Now that the render has finished, if I open up the destination folder, as you can see now we have all these separate JPEG or JPG files for each render element. For now, let's disable separate render channels and take a look at the Vray frame buffer interface itself. First, let's add this current render to the history list so we can access it later on. Also, let me double click on this final render and load it in the virtual frame buffer. Also, let's hide the history window so we won't get distracted. Up here we have the Vray virtual frame buffer or VFB toolbar. On the left side, using render elements dropdown, we can select any of the available render elements. Using R, G, and B buttons, you can define which of the red, green, and blue channels to be visible, or all of them. You can switch to the alpha channel, or switch to the monochromatic mode. Then you have three very useful save options. The first icon is for saving the current channel or render element. So it only saves the active render element in the view. Let's click on the save button. Let's create a new folder inside this final render folder and maybe name it VFB. And let's name this render final render. And this time choose PNG as the format. Press save, then OK. Now, as you can see in the destination folder, the current render has been saved out as PNG. The second save option is save all image channels to separate files, which obviously saves all the individual render elements into separate images. So let's click on this button, choose JPEG for the format and name it final render separate. Now press save, then OK. If I click on the save button again, you can see all the individual render elements are going to be saved as JPEG images. Okay, finally you can save all the image channels to a single file. So let's choose this save option. And in the VFB folder that we just created, let's name it something like final render all in one. Choose OpenEXR or Vray image as the format and press the save button. Now if I go to the destination folder again, all the channels has been saved in one EXR file that can be extracted later on in your compositing application. Next we have load image, which lets you load any image in the frame buffer, and sometimes I find myself using this option to load reference images. Using clear image, you can clear out the current content of the frame buffer. It's not gonna delete it from the history list if you have already saved it there, but it's just gonna clear the current content of the frame buffer window itself. So maybe let's clear the current render and we can load it again from the history list if we want to. And this option can be useful sometimes to avoid confusion with previous renders. We have duplicate to max frame buffer, which creates a duplicate of the current render in the 3ds max frame buffer. Track mouse while rendering forces Vray to render the closest bucket found to the mouse pointer. So if I start the render and enable this option, you can see wherever the mouse is, the closest buckets around it will be rendered. And by the way, the render is so fast because I've increased the noise threshold to about 0.1. So we're gonna get this fast renders, but it's very noisy. Now let me stop the render and disable track mouse while rendering. Also, let's clear the frame buffer using clear image command. Next we have region render, which lets us to render the specific region that we need. So let's select any region in the scene by clicking and dragging. And now if I press the render button, only this region will be rendered and the rest of the image will be ignored. Next we have link VFB to PD Player. PD Player is an image viewer with some advanced functionalities by Chaos Group. We have some comparison options. What we can do in the history window is to define two images as A and B images. Maybe let's use this shade 7000 as image A and this incandescent 3200 as image B. Now compare horizontal is enabled and we can compare those two images. We can change it to a vertical comparison or using this other tool, swap and AB images. Let me disable comparison for now. And using these last two buttons we can start and stop the render obviously. The next thing I want to talk about is the history window, which you can enable it using this show virtual frame buffer history window. The Vray virtual frame buffer allows the user to keep a history of previously rendered images, which is extremely useful. First, you need to enable history using this button. On the right side, you have this menu, and if you click history settings, you can define where the images in the history list will be saved on your disk and also define a maximum size of the history images on the disk. I think by default it's something about 100 megabytes, but you can increase it like me if you want to save more renders in your history list, especially if you have render elements and you are rendering high resolution images. This 100 megabytes can be reached in a few renders. Okay. We have the save option, which saves the current image in the frame buffer to the history list. So if I just press save, you can see the current image has been added to the history and I can visit it later on. Then we have load, which loads the image selected in the render history to the virtual frame buffer. You can do the same by simply double clicking on the image in the history list or right clicking on the image and choosing load. Using the remove button, you can remove the selected image from the render history, or you can simply right click and press delete. And we have A and B, where you can select your desired image and press one of these buttons to define it as image A or B for image comparison that we did a few moments ago. And if you right click on any of the images in the history list, you get some very useful options. Edit comment lets you add a text comment to the image, and it can be very useful later on, and I have been using it throughout this course. Now load Vray settings, which basically sets the current render settings to the ones used to render the selected image. And obviously this option is very useful, and if you remember throughout this course I have been telling you that, for example, this render you can simply right click on it and choose load Vray settings, and the settings that was used to render this particular image will be used in your render setup dialog, which will be very, very useful. We have compare Vray settings, which shows a table with the differences between the settings used to render this selected image and the settings that are currently set in the Vray renderer. And we have load color corrections, which loads the virtual frame buffer color corrections control from the selected image. And we have reload history, and this basically rereads the history image list, and this may be useful if the history folder is updated outside of 3ds Max or something like that. Now let's take a look at the color correction controls here. First, let's load the final render from the history list. To access color correction controls, you need to enable show corrections control on the lower section of the interface. And now you get some very basic but extremely useful color correction options. Using the global button up here, you can save the current state of all the color correction tools to be reused later on, and using load, you can load the file that you have previously saved. Also, you can do the same for each of the corrections individually using this menu on the right side of all the corrections. You can reset them to their default state as well using this reset option. To enable a certain correction, simply check the empty checkbox on the left side of the color correction name. As we have been using these correction tools throughout our course, I'm going to be very fast and quickly just take a look at them. Exposure, we have the exposure, which basically gives us a bunch of options. We have exposure controls, which controls the overall exposure of the render, and each step basically will make the render twice brighter or darker. So from 0 to 1 the scene gets twice brighter, and from, let's say, 2 to 1 the scene gets twice darker. Highlight burn selectively adjust the exposure of only bright parts of the scene, and contrast increases or decreases the overall contrast of the render, obviously. Now let me reset the exposure and disable it. White balance, as we have discussed earlier, just adjust the white balance of the render. Hue and saturation basically is to shift the colors of the image or control the overall saturation or lightness of the render. Using color balance, we can adjust the overall tone of the image in the shadows, midtones, and highlights of the image. Altogether, when all is selected, or individually adjust the tone of the shadows, midtones, and highlights of the image. We have used this correction numerous times during the course, and I assume you are quite familiar with how it works. And we have a level and a curve correction that work like the same exact tools in Photoshop. In this case, let's add some contrast using the level adjustment by making the low and high values to be close to each other. Let me disable levels. We can possibly get a better result if we use the curve correction. To add point to the curve, simply control click, or you can right click on the point to change its type, or select the point and move it around, or shift click on it to remove it. It's a bit hard to use a curve correction when you cannot individually adjust the red, green, and blue channels, but these correction tools aren't supposed to be complete. These are just some basic adjustments, and you're probably gonna do your main color correction work in a software that's designed to do that specifically. We have background image, and this allows you to load an image and use it as a background for your rendering, and you're probably gonna do that again in post, but here is a tool just to test what it's gonna be looking like later on. Right now, Vray Sky is our background. Let me open up environment window and disable use map and render the scene again. Now that the render is finished and we don't have any background, if we enable background image, we can choose an image to be used as the background of the render. In the images folder, let's use this sky image. And as you can see, it's being used as the background image. If you enable as foreground, the image will be on top of the render. Let's disable background image and load the final render again. And finally, we have LUT, OCIO, and ICC color corrections, and these allow you to load an LUT, OCIO, or ICC color profile and color correct your image based on the information in those color profiles. In this case, let's enable LUT, which stands for lookup table. Click on the load button, and in the render output folder of this lesson, there is a .cube file which you can load here. Now this file tries to color correct the image based on the .cube file, and if I just disable this convert option, we might be able to see what this .cube file is trying to do. Any correction done with the LUT, OCIO, or ICC corrections can only be previewed in the frame buffer and won't be saved with the image. Let's disable all the corrections for now. In the lower section of the V-Ray frame buffer, there are a bunch of options that we haven't discussed yet. Force color clamping forces color clamping in the V-Ray virtual frame buffer. Show pixel information. If enabled, it always opens the info window, which will give you information about the pixel you right-click the mouse pointer on. If you right-click the mouse pointer over a pixel without turning this setting on, you will see the info dialog only while your mouse button is down. Then we have different color correction tools that we discussed a moment ago. We have display colors in sRGB space, which displays the image in sRGB color space. Click and hold the left mouse button to switch between sRGB color space and ICC. Use LUT correction, which enables and disables the effect of the lookup table loaded in the color correction settings. You can hold on to choose between LUT and OCIO color corrections. We have the show VFB history window. Use pixel aspect, which enables visualization of the pixel aspect ratio. We have the stereo button to preview the stereoscopic effect if available, which we discussed it in the camera section of the course. And we also have the open lens effect settings that we also discussed in the camera section. Using this small button, you can open up the V-Ray message window, which we discussed it in a later lesson, and you can also show the stamp controls and apply the stamp, which we'll also be discussing it in a later lesson in this section. Perfect. In this lesson, we learned about the V-Ray virtual frame buffer, both its settings in the render setup window and its interface. See you in the next lesson.